Well, my Apple Watch tells me it's 11 o'clock, and we always have to believe in everything Apple tells us, so I would suggest we start. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Adam Blackwell, the Vice President International at Development Services Group, and on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, better known as GTTAC, I will be moderating this session. For those of you who don't know us at GTTAC, it was created by Development Services Group and our partners at George Mason University, the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, led by Dr. Louise Shelley, to support the contract that we have with the Department of State to develop a database of global terrorism incidents, and to prepare the annual annex of statistical information on terrorism, and to help prepare and edit the congressionally mandated country reports on terrorism. We do this with a combination of technology, data collection, and a team of well-trained, multilingual, multicultural data analysts, many of whom are listening in today. This is our next installment in a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. If any of you listening would like to present in the future, please either drop me a message through the chat or send me an email. Let me just clarify that the views expressed here are those of the speaker, not necessarily Development Services Group, GMU, or the State Department. I'm personally very delighted to host for this session Dr. Rohan Gunaratna, who is an international terrorism expert and head of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He served as a counterterrorism instructor for GIGN, CTSO, DSS, US Navy SEALs, the Swiss Federal Police, NYPD, and the Australian Federal Police, to name but a few. He conducted field research in conflict zones, including Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Kashmir, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Colombia. He's an author and editor of 12 books, including Inside Al Qaeda, Global Network of Terror. Dr. Gunaratna is also a lead author of Jane's Counterterrorism, a handbook for the counterterrorism practitioners. He also serves on the editorial board of the journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism and Political Violence. I recently read, and I think we've distributed to all participants, a paper in which he participated in terrorism in the time of the pandemic, exploiting mayhem. Dr. Gunaratna, you may not know this, but as an 18-year-old, I was in Sri Lanka on a World Youth Program in the middle of a very difficult period. Very fond memories of your country. So as some of you may have heard, Dr. Gunaratna will speak for 20 minutes, 25 minutes. We'll then ask questions through the chat feature of Zoom, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's at the very bottom panel. Dr. Gunaratna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam Blackwell. Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to focus on the contemporary threat of terrorism. Today, there are two principal terrorist groups that present a global threat. One is the mothership Al Qaeda, and the second group is the Islamic State. The Americans refer to this group as ISIS or ISIL. I call it Islamic State because the group changed its name from the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq to the Islamic State in 2014, June 29th. So let me refer to the group that you call ISIS as Islamic State. Both these groups have radically transformed since 2014. The global threat of terrorism increased dramatically. 2013, 2014, 15, 16, it peaked. And after that, the number of incidents of terrorism have sharply decreased. It is largely because of multiple coalitions, the American-led coalition, the Arab-led coalition, and the Russian-led coalition participating in the fight. But we also saw that the Iranians have funded and supported so many ground operations in Iraq and in Syria that diminished the strengths and the capabilities of the Islamic State. Some of that has not been acknowledged publicly, but I want to say that it was a very significant multinational effort that led to the reduction in the threat posed by the Islamic State. Al Qaeda itself has resurged. There's a resurgence of Al Qaeda during this period. Al Qaeda has revamped itself, and one of the associated groups of Al Qaeda is currently operating in Syria as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS. I would say that Al Qaeda is still on the march. It has very significantly mobilized and built relationships with Al-Shabaab, with the Taliban, and of course its own entities operating in Yemen, the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, now transformed, but still is operating in the West African region. So what we are seeing is that in terms of numbers, still most of the terrorism occurs in the Levant region of the Middle East and also other parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And this is closely followed by the threat in sub-Saharan Africa. So Africa is one of the epicenters of terrorism. In our own assessment, the number of incidents in Africa continues to rise, and the threat is spreading both from the eastern edge of Africa, Somalia, and also the western edge of Africa, Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and that region. So in many ways, the threat has cascaded from Maghreb or North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, Egypt, into that Sahel region. Of course, there is still a continuing threat in the North African region. Then we have also seen the threat has significantly shifted to the Asian region, mostly to Afghanistan. Pakistan has done exceptionally well to contain the threat, although there are a number of incidents and extremist groups operating in Pakistan. Today, Afghanistan has emerged as an alternative theater to Syria and Iraq. Then beyond Middle East, beyond Africa, beyond South Asia, the threat has spread also to parts of Northeast Asia, most notably to Xinjiang, Western China that borders Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as to the Southeast Asian region, where the terrorists have built very significant capabilities in eastern Indonesia and the southern Philippines. The southern Philippines itself is a province of the Caliphate called the Wilayat Sharq Asia, or the East Asian province. There are other provinces around the world, but let me share with you that the number of provinces have significantly increased in 2019 with the creation of dedicated provinces in Pakistan and in India. As you know, the world's biggest Muslim population do not live in the Middle East or in Africa. In fact, 63% of the world's Muslim population live in Asia. The world's largest country, or the country that is hosting the world's largest Muslim population, is Indonesia, followed by India and Pakistan. The type of Islam in Asia is different from the Middle Eastern Islam. Middle Eastern Islam largely is influenced by the developments in what happened to them as a result of the Israeli conflict with the Middle East. But in Asia, Middle East, more moderate, tolerate, they value coexistence, they live under large Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, and other communities. But we are seeing very significant radicalization of the Asian Muslims during the pandemic. And that is because of two reasons. One is that the number of terrorist incidents globally, including in Asia, has diminished because of lockdowns, partial lockdowns, and because of the pandemic restrictions. But more people are spending time online, and they are radicalizing each other. They are influencing each other. And we have seen this through very detailed research conducted in the Asian region. And I'm very happy to share this information with any of you if you are interested to have them. So there are two broad trends. One is the number of terrorist incidents have diminished. In fact, the downward trajectory would have continued if not for the incidents in France and Austria, and of course the momentum these incidents have created have also resulted in two incidents in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia. So what we are seeing is, anyway, the threat in terms of the number of incidents is decreasing, but in terms of radicalization online, that is politicization, radicalization, and mobilization of Muslims, these numbers have significantly increased. So our assessment is that when the pandemic diminish, the threat of incidents will again go up. But when it goes up, certainly there will be more sympathizers and more supporters. Second major trend that I want to share with you is one of the reaction of the Muslim community. We have seen that with the incidents in France, the Muslim fury, the anger of the Muslims, the resentment of the Muslims have increased. And I believe that it is very important for the Western nations, especially, to maintain their freedom of speech, but freedom of speech with responsibility. And during this period, it is very important for there to be a greater understanding between the leaders, so that all leaders will call for calm. And if there is no such understanding, terrorism will continue to peak, and there will be more incidents, and these incidents will cascade towards December and will manifest in attacks during the Christmas period. We call that period the bombing season, because most threat groups become active during that period. They target churches and other events during that period. And I think that what I would forecast is that in the future, in the immediate future, that the threat of terrorism will grow. It is because of the very significant radicalization of segments of communities that have taken place online during the pandemic, when more terrorists and extremists are spending time online rather than operating in the physical space. These are very brief remarks that I have made, and I want to conclude these remarks, and I'm very happy to take any questions you have. Thank you.
Folks, just to remind everybody that I'm waiting for questions in the chat area. I have one for you, Doctor. As you know, I think, as I said in the introduction, we are currently preparing this database of incidents for our friends at the State Department. And one of the things that we have seen, despite the pandemic, is an actual increase in the number of terrorism incidents. I mean, obviously, the ones you have mentioned in Europe, but we are seeing continued spikes in the Sahel area of Africa, the Congo, Mozambique, and other areas. I just wondered whether you have given any thought to how this pandemic will have, whether it's transformed or impacted the authorities' capabilities to mitigate the terrorism threat.
There are two observations that I want to make. Number one is that the number of incidents in the battlefields have increased, but the number of incidents off the battlefield has diminished. So off the battlefields, the lockdowns, partial lockdowns, and pandemic restrictions have limited mass gatherings and the mobility of these groups. But wherever in the conflict areas, what we call the battlefield areas, the numbers have increased because the government troops during this time, they have devoted their resources to managing COVID. Government resources in terms of troops and manpower, they are occupied in pandemic regulation duties. So my own thinking is that in terms of incidents, in the battlefield, yes. Off the battlefield, no. This is one trend. Now, with regard to what is likely to happen is that with the COVID numbers increasing, we are seeing that there will be more restrictions, but that will impact again off the battlefield. But in the battlefield, these groups will become stronger and bigger and more capable, and they will pose a much bigger threat. I have collected, together with a colleague of mine, about 300 posts, say between 300 to 340 posts by Islamist and right-wing groups pertaining to the pandemic. And I can also tell you that the pandemic narrative is changing. Pandemic, the momentum has diminished, but certainly it was weaponized, it was utilized by these threat groups very effectively, especially during the early period. So the earliest posts pertain to what was happening in China, where the terrorists said, the jihadist terrorists said that this is a punishment from God for what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang, in Western China. But later when it spread to Iran, the terrorists said, oh, this is a punishment for the Shia. And later when the pandemic spread to Europe, they said this is the punishment for the Western nations because there was firebombing of Baghuz and so many people died. There was to use the terrorist terminology, they said there was a Holocaust of Baghuz. So, but today I think that with every country being infected, the terrorists cannot use the pandemic argument so much in their favor. But certainly we should now look at what is likely to happen in the coming months and coming years, especially if there is a vaccine, then what will be the reaction of these groups?
Okay, thank you. I have been a very bad moderator, and our colleague Rob McCusker has pointed out that I misspoke. Questions should obviously go through the Q&A function, not the chat function. Again, I apologize for that. I have a question here from Dr. Shelley, who says, how are you seeing funding to support this terrorism activity? Are you seeing more of fundraising online?
Firstly, I thank Louis Shelley for that question. What we are seeing is that during this period, the terrorists are mostly using the net, the internet, because more terrorists are spending time online. So I can speak based on the data that we have collected from the Asian region. And based on that, I can tell you that there is more fundraising efforts that are continuing. And it is not only the Islamic State, it is also Al Qaeda centric groups. And we have proposed a model for detecting terrorist finance, that is to detect terrorist finance in 4 stages. One is the collection stage, the storage stage, the movement stage, and the dispersal stage. So we have developed some indicators, signs and clues that we have shared with the banking and the financial community to detect this. But I want to tell you that our indicators are not very effective because these groups are using methods that we did not plan and prepare for. So I want to say that it is so important for our response also to be dynamic so that we will be able to be effective in countering the most recent methodologies used by these groups to raise funds.
Thank you. A question from Rob McCusker, who's also on our GTAC advisory board. He wants to know, to what extent is the purported terrorism, organized crime convergence a reality?
Terrorists have always used criminality, but terrorists are, we call them terrorist criminals, but the motive of the criminal groups is always economic, but the terrorist motivation is political. But there are many occasions where the terrorists will reach out to the criminal organizations to get identity documents, to gain access to for various areas to travel so that they can pay human smugglers, then for arms trafficking, to procure weapons. So the nexus, the terrorist criminal nexus continues. I don't think that there is any significant change in the relationship between the terrorists and the criminals during this period. Of course, more people are resorting to crime during this period to survive. So the number of criminal activity, especially online, has increased. And I think we have to closely monitor how the terrorist groups, the politically motivated terrorist groups, will work with these economically motivated individuals and groups in the coming months and coming years.
I have another question here for you. In which area of, or which part of the world do you expect terrorism attacks to increase during the, I believe you mentioned during the Christmas time?
The terrorist threat will significantly increase in Europe because it is very clear the European nations have now all sided with France, not all, maybe most. And just day before yesterday, the EU issued a statement that they will take far-reaching measures, including registering clerics, Muslim religious clerics that preach in Europe. They will also regulate preachers who are traveling into Europe, and they will also ensure that those who go to prison, the terrorists who go to prison, that they serve beyond the prison term if they are still radical. So for the first time, I'm seeing Europe being very decisive in the fight. And for a long time, the Europeans have been very complacent, while the threat groups build very significant capabilities in the migrant and the diaspora communities. But certainly in Europe, there will be a spike in attacks, especially leading up to Christmas and during that period, But I would say that there will also be attacks outside Europe, because the momentum of attacks will generate other groups to mount attacks. We have already seen 2 attacks in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, but certainly we are likely to see other killings that will take place in Asia. There have been a few incidents in Asia, but certainly during Christmas period, it is likely that they will target Western targets, Western infrastructure, Western government and private infrastructure, and even Western nationals who are in other parts of the world. So I think during this period, we have to do everything possible to provide protection to Europeans and to other Western nationals, and also to Jewish targets, because we have seen some references to targeting Jewish nationals and their businesses. Most recently, I have seen that they also want to attack UAE and Saudi Arabia because of their approach to Israel. So I think the Saudi attacks should not come as a surprise. And I think everything should be done also to prevent escalation of threat in Saudi Arabia and also future possible attacks in UAE.
Thank you. I have a compound question here from Dr. Sengiz, who's part of our GTTAC team. He says, or asks, we have seen we've seen a geographic expansion of ISIS and Al Qaeda ideologies. Groups in Syria and Mali have pledged allegiance to Al Qaeda, whereas others in Africa and East Africa have preferred to declare loyalty to ISIS. For example, all jihadist groups, including Abu Sayyaf, have preferred to be under the banner of the ISIS flag. How do you explain it, is, I guess, part of the question. And second part is, why do jihadist groups in the Philippines choose ISIS?
Let me answer the second question first. That is, in the Philippines, especially in the region called Mindanao, 2 groups, they have broken away from the parent group of Abu Sayyaf, and they have created the Islamic State in the Philippines. The Bangsa Moro Islamic Freedom Fighters, which is a splinter of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, they have also broken away and they have joined the Islamic State. So we have seen a very significant shift of a number of groups being formed, number of Islamic State-centric groups being formed in the Philippines. So we have Islamic State Sulu, Islamic State Basilan, Islamic State Maguinlao, 2 groups, and Islamic State Lanao formed in the Philippines. So southern Philippines is undergoing very significant transformation from Al Qaeda centric groups to Islamic centric groups, and the threat is likely to increase. We have also seen foreign fighters traveling. Just last month, a young woman who was 20 years old, she was arrested, and her parents were Indonesian. Both of them returned from Turkey. They were planning to enter Syria, they couldn't enter. So the parents and the daughter came to Indonesia. The parents did attack against the cathedral in Polo that I myself visited. I was very heartbroken. It's a very beautiful cathedral. Both husband and wife killed herself, and last month their daughter was arrested, and she was also planning to mount a suicide attack. So we are seeing that even foreign terrorist fighters, these are Indonesians traveling to the Philippines. The young girl who was arrested is Sisi. Sisi's husband was Baso, and Baso was the Samarinda Bomai of the Indonesian church, and he also came, and of course he was intercepted and killed by the Philippine military. The Andy Baso was killed. So we are seeing even a flow of foreign fighters to the Philippines, but mostly from the region, not from Africa and the Middle East. Although there are still some foreign fighters from the Middle East surviving in the Philippines. Now, with regard to more groups pledging allegiance to the Islamic State, yes, that is happening since 2015, since 2016, because we are seeing a global expansion of the Islamic State. The Islamic State has mastery of the social media, and Islamic State is able to convince other groups to join their organization. And when these groups, these local groups join the Islamic State, they receive more funding, more publicity, more prominence. So I believe that this trend will continue. Although Islamic State has very significantly suffered in Iraq and Syria, the group has not been eliminated, but the group has very significantly expanded in parts of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm going to try and combine two questions here about lone wolf or lone actor attacks. And the question is really, is this a new tactic or is this a reflection of weakness or diminished financing?
Wherever there are no structured groups operating, individuals who are radicalized, mostly online, they will mount lone wolf attacks. So we have wolf pack attacks conducted by groups, and then we have lone wolf or lone actor attacks conducted by individuals. So if you look at the Nice attacker, he's a lone wolf. He operated by himself, but radicalized. Of course, he had links to various individuals, but he did not represent a group. Then the man from Pakistan who beheaded the school teacher, he again didn't belong to a group. He was radicalized as an individual. So wherever the terrorist groups have been dismantled, terrorist cells have been dismantled, terrorist networks have been dismantled, we are seeing individuals perpetrating these attacks. Wherever there are active terrorist groups and networks and cells, it will be those groups, cells, and networks mounting attacks. So if you divide the world into two, the global north, that is North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, most of the attacks are by individuals. Unless a team comes from Asia and strikes Australia, or a team comes from Middle East and attacks Paris. So my own assessment is that lone wolf attacks will be the trend in North America, in Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Of course, attacks by lone wolves and groups will be the trend in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East.
Thank you. You mentioned the increase in jihadist extremism in South Asia. How about anti-Muslim extremism? Do you see a similar trend?
Anti-Muslim extremism has been growing since 9/11. So the Islamophobia is a result of 9/11. And after 9/11, we are seeing that this trend is continuing. And I would say that as a result of that, so many far-right groups have emerged. So far-right terrorism is on a growth trajectory. Now, with regard to the Asian region, I want to tell you that there are groups that are angry with the Muslims. But I also want to tell you that vast majority of the Muslims are not into extremism and terrorism in Asia. Of course, some of them are moving towards exclusivism because of the influence of Wahhabism and other Middle Eastern ideologies to Asia. But we are not seeing such a large shift of anti-Muslim hatred in the Asian region, unlike in Europe, in North America, in Australia.
Thank you. I guess a good question here that's very relevant to our work on the database for State Department. And that is, I would have assumed that there would have been, even if there were as many incidents, there would be less reporting on incidents due to the pandemic. In other words, journalists were restricted in their coverage of these things. Have you noticed any impact in how journalists are covering terrorism during the pandemic?
Journalists are mostly covering terrorist incidents in the West. But the number of terrorist incidents in the West is less than 5% of the global number of incidents. For example, in Austria, the number that was killed and injured was very small, but the publicity was huge. But every day in Iraq, every day in Syria, every day in Afghanistan, 10 times more people die. But there's virtually very little coverage. For example, yesterday, a big attack in Somalia. They attacked a restaurant and a dozen people were killed. But there's virtually no coverage. So what I want to share is that coverage of incidents is very much Western-centric, Western-focused, unless Western people were killed in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, or there was a big attack where there was a mass fatality, mass casualty.
Okay. Another question. You have spoken to the cascading effects of terrorism in the Maghreb and Morocco towards the Sahel. Can you give your impressions of the potential impacts of the new buffer zone violations between Morocco and the Western Sahara, particularly when considering neighbors like Mauritania?
What we have seen is that the incidence in Mauritania is very, very small. But we are seeing a very significant radicalization of Muslims in West Africa. That is because the situation in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, was not properly controlled. So our own assessment is that the threat in that region, Niger, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, all those countries, it's going to grow in the next 5 years. And that is why I think that more countries should invest in Africa to prevent this trend. So I would urge the Americans, the Europeans, the French have already made a huge commitment for them to participate and to strengthen Africa at this point. Africa, if terrorism expands and grows, it's going to become a huge problem. And I think that we should do everything we can to mount very effective counterterrorism operations and eliminate the terrorist leaders and members, supporters, and also to protect the Muslim population, meaning have very good prevention programs and build very strong rehabilitation capabilities. These capabilities have not been built. So we have to protect the African population. We have to work in cooperation and collaboration with African partners. I will ask that we do 5 things in Africa. One is build common databases. Second, exchange personnel. 3, conduct joint training. 4, conduct joint operations. 5, share experience, expertise, and resources.
Excellent. Here's a very good question from one of our data analysts. How has the pandemic affected the support of state actors to militant groups? For example, the Turkish support to militant groups in Syria, and of course the Iranian support of militant groups in Syria and elsewhere. Have you noticed any?
I have not seen a decline in support by those state actors. The states that you referred to continue to provide assistance, because they believe that through these groups they can expand their influence and they can operate effectively without the presence of their own troops. It's a very low cost, very effective method of advancing their foreign policy and geopolitical interests.
Okay. I think I missed this question from Dr. Shelley. I guess this is in relationship to her earlier question about financing, and she's asking, are you seeing them use cryptocurrency?
Very, very sporadic, but in the Asian region, I want to tell you that one of the first groups, if not the first, to use cryptocurrency was a man called Gigi Rahmat Deva. He was in Batam, and he was directed by his mentor in Syria, Baharum Naim, and Gigi Rahmat Deva planned to attack the Marina Bay Sands, the beautiful hotel in Singapore. And Gigi Rahmat Deva had created a cell or a network called Katiba Gonggong Ribus. They were almost all Indonesian fighters except 2 Chinese Uyghurs who came from Xinjiang. And they were planning attacks. And this cell was broken and taken down. And Gigi paid for Gigi's boss, who was in Syria, the terrorist directing figure, paid for his honeymoon using bitcoins. You see, so I want to share with you that this may be the first incident where we had the use of bitcoins, and we have seen since then number of fundraising events where they have used cryptocurrency.
I have two more questions. One, I'm going to paraphrase here. You've mentioned ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, and how we refer to this group. But I guess the real question is, do you believe that we should use the term state when referring to a terrorist group?
The terrorist organization calls itself the Islamic State. Previously, it was known as Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Of course, these are terminologies that terrorists are using. They're using religious labels. They're using terms like state to show that they have power. Al Qaeda, the meaning of Al Qaeda, the real name of Al Qaeda is Al Qaeda al-Sulba, the solid base. So you can see that all these organizations use terms that are religious and that evokes emotional response. For example, the 2 main terrorist groups in Egypt, the Al-Gama al-Islami al-Masri and the Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Masri, that is the Islamic group of Egypt, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. So you can see the terms that they have used. So I want to share with you that we should always criminalize these groups, and I think that we should be very, very careful that we mention that these are the groups, that these are the terms used by terrorist groups. Now, so that these groups don't become prominent and don't speak to the emotions of the people. I also want to share with you that the Islamic State, the terrorist group that I refer to as the Islamic State, Americans refer to them as ISIL, the British call them ISIS, and the Arabs call them Daesh. And I think that it is so important that we use the term Islamic State now, but we say the so-called Islamic State, so that we don't give them any legitimacy.
Okay, here's a very interesting question. You mentioned your list of, I think it was 5 things that we should be doing to help in Africa, common databases, operations, capacity building, and so on. A lot of this is already being provided by Interpol. So the question is, shouldn't Interpol be the lead agency to prevent terrorism around the world?
Interpol Global Complex is in Singapore, and I know the Interpol operation intimately because I myself co-developed with another colleague the Interpol SOCMIN course, the Social Media Intelligence Monitoring and Tracking course. So I want to share with you that they don't have the kind of resources, the capabilities, the manpower to do these things. You see, Interpol can play a role to build law enforcement capacity, but to fight active terrorist groups, Interpol can't do it. Interpol can do investigations, but they can't fight terrorists. Terrorists are using standoff weapons. To fight terrorism, you need very highly trained, specialized troops, special operations forces from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Marines. And I think that we have, off the battlefield, we can use the police for investigation and operations. But in the battlefield, we have to have large special operations capabilities. So I think to fight the contemporary wave of terrorism, we need to build 2 capabilities. One is large intelligence communities with linguistic and other capabilities, especially for monitoring the deep, dark, and the surface web and taking action. Second is we need to increase the percentage of special operations forces in the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Marines.
Yeah, I agree with you, Doctor. I've done a lot of work with Interpol in the past, and I have often argued that we really need to reinvest in Interpol if we're going to give them the operational capacity. And obviously, from my own experience in the multilateral world, we have to avoid recreating the wheel. And Interpol does have, we have made and does have capacity. We should leverage that wherever possible and complement it with military capacity as the French and others are doing, and the Sahel as an example. I have one last question for you, and it's, do you see a nexus between Islamic terrorism and left and right wing extremism?
I have not seen, and I don't think we will see that in the future. It is because the ideologies are so different, and I will take a few minutes to explain to you the ideological differences based on my own interviews with members of the Islamic State in Iraq. I served in Iraq twice, working in Camp Cropper, the main detention center. And I was there with a Muslim cleric called Professor Muhammad bin Ali, who is currently the deputy head of the religious rehabilitation group in Singapore. And based on our interviews, I want to say that the members of the Islamic State, they are very motivated by their service to God. They are willing to kill and die. They hate non-Muslims. And they are all driven by a central concept called Al-Wala Wal-Bara. Al-Wala Wal-Bara means loyalty to Muslims and hatred to non-Muslims. To them, it's a sin to cooperate and collaborate with non-Muslims. But certainly, the Muslim terrorist groups and the right-wing groups have the same views on COVID. They have a common conspiracy. But that should not make us conclude that they are going to work together. They will never work together, in my view, because the Muslim threat groups regard non-Muslims as enemies of God, and they want to please God, and they want to attack those groups and those individuals who have not embraced the ideology that they are following. I thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Well, that, Dr. Gunaratna, brings us to the end of what I think is most people, everybody would say, has been a very interesting session. I would like to thank you on behalf of all of the team at GTAC, DSG, and personally, and Dr. Louise Shelley, and all of those who participated in this event. We hope we can stay in touch with you in Singapore, and should you ever be in the Washington, D.C. area, please look us up. Again, thank you. A good big round of applause virtually, but there you go. Thank you, sir, and we look forward to keeping in touch with the group. And if anybody else is interested in making a presentation to our speaker series, please let me know by email. Thanks very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.